The transaction should have taken 3 minutes, maybe 4 if the system was slow, but by the time Naomi Chen stood at the register of Lux Home Concepts on Chicago's Magnificent Mile, her arms full of fabric swatches and her phone buzzing with a text from Jordan telling her to get whatever she wanted for the living room redesign, she had already been waiting for 6. The store smelled like leather and sandalwood, that carefully engineered scent that luxury retailers pumped through their HVAC systems to signal that you were somewhere expensive, somewhere exclusive, somewhere that mattered. Naomi had chosen 3 throw pillows in jewel tones, a cashmere blanket the color of fog, and a set of sculptural bookends that Jordan would probably think were too modern, but that she loved for their clean lines and weight. The total came to $4,732, which would have made Naomi's stomach drop 2 years ago, when she was working 60-hour weeks at an architecture firm and living in a studio in Pilsen, but which now, in November of 2025, felt like a reasonable expense for the home she shared with Jordan Whitfield, whose net worth had been estimated by Bloomberg at $4.8 billion, and who had told her that morning over coffee in their kitchen with Lake, Michigan glittering beyond the windows, to treat the condo redesign like her own project and not to worry about the budget. She had handed over the black American Express card, the one with Jordan Whitfield etched across the bottom in raised letters, the one he had given her 3 months ago with the casual instruction to use it for household things, for furniture, for groceries, for anything she needed. Naomi had been hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of spending someone else's money, even though Jordan had made it clear that he considered the condo their shared space and that he wanted her to feel at home there. But she had gotten used to it, the way you get used to anything if it happens often enough, and by now she pulled out the black card without thinking twice, the same way she pulled out her own credit card when she was buying coffee or books, or the things that still felt distinctly hers. The cashier was a white woman, early 30s, name tag reading Monica Ashford in a crisp sans serif font. She had taken the card with a polite smile, swiped it through the reader and then paused, her eyes flicking from the screen to Naomi's face and back again. The pause was brief, barely a second, but Naomi felt it, the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. Monica's smile tightened and she said, "Just a moment, please," in a tone that was pleasant but cooler than it had been a moment before. Naomi waited. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of other customers, the soft jazz pipe through the sound system, the rustle of shopping bags. The store was busy for a Wednesday afternoon, filled with the kind of people who shopped on weekdays because they did not have 9-to-5 jobs, or because their 9-to-5 jobs were flexible enough to allow for midday excursions. Naomi had taken the afternoon off from the firm where she now worked as a senior designer, a position she had earned through a combination of talent and relentless hustle, and she was enjoying the rare luxury of wandering through stores without rushing, of imagining how different pieces might transform the condo's living room, of texting Jordan photos and getting back responses like "love it" or "maybe too much" or "you're cool, babe." Monica picked up the phone at the register, a sleek black handset that looked like it belonged in a corporate office rather than a retail store. She dialed a number, waited, and then spoke in a low voice that Naomi could not quite make out. Naomi felt the first flicker of unease, a tightness in her chest that she tried to ignore. It was probably nothing, she told herself, probably just a verification thing, a security protocol for large purchases. Except that she had used this card before at other stores and had never been asked to wait while the cashier made a phone call. Monica hung up, then looked at Naomi with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between concern and suspicion. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I need to verify this card. It'll just take a few minutes." Naomi nodded, trying to keep her voice even. "Okay. Is there a problem?" "No problem," Monica said, but the words came out too quickly, too smooth, and Naomi knew she was lying. Just standard procedure for high-value transactions. Except Naomi had been in this store before, had seen other customers make purchases just as large or larger, and had never seen anyone else subjected to a phone call and a wait. She glanced around, noting the other shoppers. A white couple in their 50s examining a dining table, a younger white man browsing lamps, an Asian woman speaking to a sales associate near the back of the store. None of them were being watched, questioned, or delayed. It was just her. If you are reading this, and have ever felt the weight of being singled out, of being treated as suspect before you have done anything wrong, Then you know the specific kind of anger that was building in Naomi's chest. It was not hot or explosive. It was cold, sharp, the kind of anger that came from a lifetime of these small moments, each one individually deniable, each one adding up to a pattern you could see but could not always prove. Monica made another call, this time speaking more loudly, and Naomi caught fragments. Yes, the name on the card is Jordan Whitfield, but the person using it is, well, it's a woman, and she doesn't. I mean, it just seems unusual. A pause. I understand, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Can you confirm the card is authorized? Naomi felt the anger sharpen. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. Excuse me, but I'm authorized to use this card. Jordan Whitfield is my boyfriend, and he gave me the card for household purchases. Monica glanced at her, and there was something in her eyes, a flicker of disbelief or disdain, quickly masked. I'm sure that's true, she said, but I still need to verify. It's policy. Policy, Naomi repeated, the word heavy with skepticism. And do you verify every card, or just the ones that don't match your assumptions about who should be shopping here? Monica's face flushed, a splotch of red spreading across her cheeks. I'm just doing my job, she said, defensive now. If there's fraud happening, I could be held responsible. And what makes you think there's fraud? Naomi asked, her voice still calm, still controlled, but with an edge that made Monica take a half step back. Monica did not answer. She turned back to the phone and Naomi heard her say, Yes, I'd like to report a potentially fraudulent transaction. The card is in the name of Jordan Whitfield, but the person attempting to use it is a black woman who claims to be his girlfriend. The purchase amount is over $4,000, and I just want to make sure everything is legitimate before I process it. And there it was. Spoken into the phone, broadcast to whoever was on the other end of the line, the assumption laid bare. A black woman using a card with a white man's name on it could not possibly be legitimate. It had to be fraud, theft, something criminal. Naomi felt the anger crest, felt the urge to shout, to demand an apology, to walk out and never come back. But she also knew that losing her temper would only confirm whatever narrative Monica had already constructed. So she stood there, silent, her hands clenched at her sides, and waited. The call took another 2 minutes. Monica spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at Naomi as though checking to make sure she had not fled or pulled a weapon. Finally, she hung up and turned back to Naomi with a tight smile. The bank is going to call the cardholder to verify, she said. It should only take a few more minutes. Naomi pulled out her phone, opened her text messages and typed quickly, Hey, the cashier at Lux Home just called the bank to report fraud because I'm using your card. They're going to call you to verify. This is ridiculous. Jordan's response came within seconds. Are you serious? I'm in a meeting, but I'll answer. This is insane. Are you okay? Naomi typed back, I'm fine. Just pissed. I'll tell you everything later. She looked up to find Monica watching her, and she met the woman's gaze without flinching. He'll confirm, Naomi said. And then I'd like to speak to your manager. Monica's expression flickered, something that might have been worry or regret, but she just nodded and turned back to the register, where the computer screen glowed with the transaction details, frozen, waiting for authorization that should never have been necessary. Jordan's phone rang during the quarterly board meeting, the screen lighting up with a number he did not recognize, but a Chicago area code he did. He glanced at the executives seated around the glass conference table, all of them mid-discussion about projected revenue for the next fiscal year, and made a quick decision. Excuse me, he said, standing. I need to take this. He stepped out of the conference room into the hallway, the door closing behind him with a soft hiss, and answered the call. Mr. Whitfield, a woman's voice said, professional, efficient. This is Rebecca Traynor from the Fraud Prevention Department at American Express. We've received a report of a potentially fraudulent transaction on your black card, and I need to verify some information with you. Jordan felt a spike of irritation. What kind of transaction? A purchase at a store called Lux Home Concepts in Chicago for just over $4,000. The merchant reported that the person using the card does not match the cardholder profile, and we need to confirm whether this is an authorized use. Jordan's irritation turned to anger, sharp and immediate. The person using the card is my girlfriend, Naomi Chen. She's absolutely authorized to use it. I gave her the card specifically for household purchases. There's no fraud here. There was a pause on the line, and then Rebecca said, I see, so you're confirming that Ms. Chen has your permission to use the card? Yes, Jordan said, his voice hard, unequivocally, and I'd like to know why the merchant felt it necessary to report this as fraud. What reason did they give? Another pause, longer this time. The merchant indicated that the person using the card did not appear to be the cardholder, and they were concerned about potential unauthorized use. Did they describe my girlfriend? Jordan asked, already knowing the answer. Rebecca hesitated. They mentioned that the person was a woman, and that, well, there was a discrepancy between the name on the card and the person presenting it. Jordan's jaw tightened. He knew what discrepancy meant in this context. He had spent enough time navigating the subtle and not-so-subtle biases of corporate America to recognize coded language when he heard it. "Let me be very clear," he said. "My girlfriend is authorized to use my card. She has been authorized for months. This is not fraud, this is profiling. And I'm going to be filing a complaint about the merchant's conduct." "I understand, Mr. Whitfield," Rebecca said, her tone apologetic now. "I'll authorize the transaction immediately, and I'll make a note in your file that Ms. Chen is an authorized user. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience." Jordan hung up without saying goodbye, stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing hard, and then pulled up Naomi's contact and called her directly. She answered on the first ring. "Hey," she said, and he could hear the strain in her voice, the anger she was holding in check. "I just talked to Amex," he said. "It's authorized. You're good to go, Naomi. I'm so sorry. This is—" He struggled to find the words, settled on the simplest truth. "This is bullshit. Racist bullshit." "Yeah," Naomi said quietly. "It is. The cashier is processing the transaction now, but Jordan, I want to talk to the manager. I'm not letting this slide." "Good," Jordan said. "Don't. And when you're done, come to the office. We're going to figure out what to do about this." They hung up, and Jordan stood in the hallway of his company's headquarters, the glass and steel tower that bore his name on the lobby directory, and felt the familiar, exhausting weight of knowing that no amount of money or success could insulate the people he loved from the assumptions and biases that shaped how the world saw them. He had experienced it himself, the double-takes and the questions and the skepticism that followed him in spaces where people did not expect a black man to belong, but he had built enough armor over the years to deflect most of it. Naomi, though, was newer to this level of wealth, newer to the scrutiny that came with it, and he hated that she was learning these lessons in real time, in public, with strangers who saw her skin before they saw anything else. He returned to the conference room, where the meeting had continued without him, and when his CFO asked if everything was all right, Jordan said curtly, "We'll discuss it later," and tried to focus on the revenue projections and the market analysis, even though his mind was elsewhere, already planning the steps he would take to make sure the people who had humiliated Naomi understood that their assumptions had consequences. Back at Lux Home Concepts, the transaction finally went through. Monica handed Naomi the receipt with a strained smile and said, "Thank you for your patience. Let me get someone to help you carry these to your car." "I'd like to speak to the manager first," Naomi said, her voice even. Monica's smile disappeared. "Of course, let me get him." She disappeared into the back of the store, and Naomi stood at the register, her shopping bags at her feet, feeling the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Around her, the store continued its quiet hum, customers browsing and sales associates offering assistance, no one aware of what had just transpired except her and Monica and whoever had been listening on the other end of those phone calls. A man emerged from the back, mid-40s, white, wearing a suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, and a smile that was meant to be reassuring but came across as patronizing. His name tag read Daniel Rourke, General Manager. "Ms. Chen," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Daniel Rourke. I understand there was some confusion with your transaction. I want to apologize for any inconvenience." Naomi did not shake his hand. "Confusion," she repeated. "Is that what you're calling it? Your cashier accused me of fraud. She called the bank and reported a fraudulent transaction because I'm using my boyfriend's credit card. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't ask if I was authorized. She just assumed I was committing a crime." Daniel's smile faltered. "I'm sure Monica was just following protocol. We take fraud very seriously here, and sometimes that means we have to verify transactions that seem, well, unusual." "Unusual," Naomi said, and she heard the edge in her own voice, sharp and unforgiving. What was unusual about it? The fact that the card had a different name, or the fact that I'm black, and the name on the card is white. Daniel blinked, taken aback. I don't think race had anything to do with it, he said, but his tone was uncertain now, defensive. Then explain to me why I was the only customer in this store who had to wait while a cashier called the bank to report fraud, Naomi said. Explain to me why Monica felt it necessary to describe me as a black woman when she made that call. Explain to me why you think this was anything other than racial profiling. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'll need to review the situation, he said finally, but I assure you we don't tolerate discrimination in this store. If Monica acted inappropriately, we'll address it. Naomi stared at him, weighing her options. She could push harder, demand more, but she also knew that standing in this store arguing with a manager who was already in defensive mode would accomplish little. What she needed was to document everything, to build a case and to make sure that this incident became more than just a bad customer service experience, swept under the rug with a hollow apology. I want the name of your corporate office, she said, and I want a copy of the transaction records, including the timestamp of when Monica called the bank. Daniel looked uncomfortable. I can give you the corporate contact information, but I'll need to check with our legal team about releasing internal records. Then check, Naomi said, because I'm going to file a formal complaint, and I'm going to make sure people know what happened here today. Daniel nodded, pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. The card listed a corporate headquarters address in Atlanta and a phone number for customer relations. I'm truly sorry you had this experience, he said, and this time he sounded like he meant it, though whether he was sorry for what had happened or sorry that it was about to become a problem for him, Naomi could not tell. She took the card, picked up her shopping bags and walked out of the store without another word. The November air was cold, the wind coming off the lake sharp enough to make her eyes water, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing hard, feeling the anger and humiliation and frustration all tangled together in her chest. Then she pulled out her phone and called Jordan back. I'm done here, she said when he answered. I'm coming to your office. I'll be waiting, Jordan said. Naomi walked to the parking garage where she had left her car, a sensible Honda Accord that she had bought used 4 years ago and that she refused to trade in, despite Jordan's offers to get her something newer, something more expensive. The car was hers, earned with her own money, and it represented a kind of independence that she was not ready to give up, even if she was now living in a multi-million-dollar condo and using a credit card with a spending limit that made her old salary look like pocket change. She drove through the downtown traffic, the city grey and cold under the November sky, and tried to organize her thoughts, to figure out what she wanted to say, what she wanted to do, how she wanted to respond to what had just happened. By the time she reached Jordan's office, a gleaming tower in the loop with his company's logo etched in steel above the entrance, she had a plan. Not a complete plan, not yet, but the outlines of one. The shape of what needed to happen if this was going to be more than just another story of a black woman being profiled and dismissed. She parked in the visitor lot, checked in with the security desk, and took the elevator to the 40th floor, where Jordan's office occupied a corner with views of the lake and the river and the sprawl of the city stretching out in all directions. Jordan met her at the elevator, pulled her into a hug before she could say anything, and held her for a long moment. I'm so sorry, he said into her hair. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. Naomi let herself lean into him, let herself feel the comfort of his presence, and then pulled back and looked up at him. I'm okay, she said. I mean, I'm pissed, but I'm okay. And I think we need to do something about this. Jordan nodded. Agreed. Let's go to my office and figure out what that looks like. They walked down the hallway, past the open floor plan where Jordan's employees sat at their desks, coding and designing and managing the infrastructure of the company that had made him a billionaire by the age of 36. Jordan's office was at the end of the hall, a large space with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams and notes from his last brainstorming session. He closed the door behind them, gestured for Naomi to sit, and then sat beside her on the couch rather than behind his desk. Tell me everything, he said. Naomi walked him through it, start to finish, the way Monica had paused after swiping the card, the phone calls, the description of her as a black woman, the manager's hollow apology. Jordan listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the story went on, and when she finished he was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped together, his jaw tight. "This is exactly the kind of thing I was afraid of," he said finally. "Not for me, I can handle it, but for you, for anyone close to me. The assumptions people make, the way they see a black person with access to money and immediately think crime instead of relationship or employment or 1,000 other legitimate possibilities." Naomi nodded. "I know. And the thing is, I've dealt with this before. I've been followed in stores, questioned about whether I can afford things, treated like I don't belong. But this felt different, because it wasn't just about me. It was about you, about us, about the assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly be with a white billionaire unless she was stealing from him." Jordan flinched at that, the bluntness of it, but he did not argue. "So what do you want to do?" he asked. Naomi took a breath, felt the clarity of the decision settling over her. "I want to hold them accountable. Not just the cashier, not just the manager, but the company. I want them to acknowledge what happened, to change their policies to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. And I think the only way to do that is to make it public." Jordan studied her, his eyes searching hers. "You understand what that means, right? Once this is public, it's out of our control. People are going to have opinions, some of them awful. They're going to question you, question us, dig into our lives. It's going to be invasive and it's going to be exhausting." "I know," Naomi said, "but I also know that if I don't say something, if I just let it go, then I'm complicit. I'm saying it's okay for cashiers to profile black customers, for stores to treat us like criminals, for companies to get away with this because they know most people won't have the time or the resources or the platform to fight back. I have those things, Jordan. We have those things. And I think we have a responsibility to use them." Jordan reached for her hand, squeezed it. "Okay," he said, "then let's do it right. We get lawyers, PR people, advocates, we document everything, we build a case, and we make sure we're not just venting on social media, but actually pushing for change." Naomi felt something loosen in her chest, the relief of being understood, of having a partner who did not question her anger or tell her she was overreacting. "Yeah," she said, "that's what I want." Over the next several days, they assembled a team. Jordan's in-house legal counsel reached out to a civil rights attorney named Marcus Thompson, who had built a reputation taking on discrimination cases against major retailers and corporations. They brought in a crisis communications firm run by a black woman named Shayla Grant, who understood the dynamics of racial justice stories in the media and knew how to navigate the inevitable backlash. And they consulted with advocacy organizations that specialized in consumer rights and racial profiling, gathering data and precedent and strategies for making the case not just about one incident, but about a pattern. Naomi spent hours drafting a statement, revising it with input from Marcus and Shayla, trying to find the balance between anger and clarity, between personal narrative and systemic critique. She wrote about the incident in detail, the phone calls and the assumptions and the humiliation of being treated like a thief in a store where she had every right to shop. She wrote about the broader context, the research showing that black shoppers were routinely profiled and subjected to heightened scrutiny, the stories of other people who had faced similar treatment. And she wrote about what she wanted: an apology, policy changes, accountability, and a commitment from Lux Home Concepts to do better. If you are following this story and thinking about the countless times you or someone you love has been treated as suspect, as other, as less than, then you understand why Naomi's decision to speak out mattered. These stories matter because they name what is often invisible, because they demand that we see the harm that assumptions and biases cause, and because they insist that change is possible if enough people refuse to stay silent. And if this resonates with you, if you see yourself or your experiences reflected here, then consider sharing this story, talking about it, letting it be part of the larger conversation we need to have about who belongs, who is believed, and who is held accountable. On November 20th, Naomi posted her statement to Instagram, where she had a modest following of a few thousand people, mostly friends and colleagues from the architecture world. She included a photo of the Lux Home Concepts receipt, the timestamp visible, and a short video she had recorded in Jordan's office speaking directly to the camera about what had happened and why it mattered. The video was calm, measured, but there was no mistaking the anger underneath, the refusal to let this be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Within hours, the post had been shared by several prominent activists and influencers who had large platforms and a history of amplifying stories of racial injustice. By the end of the day, it had been picked up by local news outlets in Chicago, and by the next morning, national media was covering it. The story had all the elements that made it irresistible: race, wealth, a clear villain in the form of a cashier who had called the bank, and a protagonist who was articulate and sympathetic and connected to a billionaire whose name carried weight. Lux Home Concepts issued a statement within 24 hours, a brief, carefully worded response that expressed regret for Naomi's experience and promised to review their training and policies. It was the kind of statement that said everything and nothing, designed to acknowledge the complaint without admitting wrongdoing, and it did little to slow the wave of outrage building online. The backlash was swift and loud. People shared their own stories of being profiled in stores, of being followed by security, of being asked to show receipts or prove they could afford the items they were purchasing. The hashtag #ShopWhileBlack trended on Twitter, and several celebrities weighed in, expressing support for Naomi and calling for a boycott of Lux Home Concepts until the company took meaningful action. A few commenters pushed back, arguing that the cashier had just been doing her job, that fraud prevention was a real concern, that Naomi was playing the victim. But those voices were drowned out by the chorus of people who recognized the incident for what it was: a clear, undeniable case of racial profiling. Jordan, who had mostly stayed out of the public eye throughout his career, released his own statement, brief but pointed. "What happened to Naomi is unacceptable. No one should be treated as a criminal for the color of their skin, least of all in a store where they are a paying customer. I stand with her fully, and I will be using every resource at my disposal to ensure that Lux Home Concepts and other retailers understand that this behavior has consequences." The statement was covered widely, in part because Jordan's name carried weight, in part because it was unusual for a billionaire to weigh in so directly on a consumer rights issue. Some people praised him for using his platform to support Naomi, while others accused him of leveraging his wealth to punish a company that had dared to question his girlfriend. The debate raged online, in comment sections and op-eds and cable news segments, and Naomi found herself at the center of a storm she had anticipated, but that still felt overwhelming in its intensity. She received hundreds of messages, some supportive, some hateful. Strangers offered their solidarity, shared their own stories, thanked her for speaking out. Others accused her of being opportunistic, of using Jordan's money to destroy the lives of working-class employees, of making everything about race when it might have been a simple mistake. A few messages were openly racist, calling her slurs, telling her she did not belong in spaces like Lux Home Concepts, suggesting that the cashier had been right to question her. Naomi tried not to read the comments, but it was impossible to look away entirely. She set up filters on her social media, blocked the worst offenders, and leaned on Jordan and her close friends for support. But the weight of it pressed down on her, the constant scrutiny, the feeling that her life had been turned inside out and put on display for strangers to judge. The turning point came on November 25th, when a former employee of Lux Home Concepts reached out through the email address Naomi had listed in her statement. The email was brief and carefully worded. "I worked at the Chicago location until last year. What happened to you is not isolated. There is a culture of profiling at this company, especially toward black customers. If you want to talk, I have documentation." Naomi forwarded the email to Marcus Thompson, who arranged a call within hours. The former employee, whose name was Terrence Mitchell, had worked as a sales associate at Lux Home for 3 years before leaving in frustration over what he described as management's tacit encouragement of racial profiling. He told Naomi and Marcus that there had been informal policies, never written down but communicated through meetings and one-on-one conversations with managers, that certain customers required more scrutiny. Black customers were more likely to be followed by sales associates, more likely to have their payment methods questioned, more likely to be asked to leave if they were browsing without purchasing. "Do you have any proof?" Marcus asked. "I have emails," Terrence said. "I have text from managers, and I have recordings from a couple of staff meetings where they basically told us to watch out for certain types of customers. They never said it explicitly, but everyone knew what they meant." "Would you be willing to share those?" Naomi asked. There was a pause on the line. "I would," Terrence said, "but I signed an NDA when I left. If they find out I'm talking to you, they'll sue me." Marcus jumped in. "Send me the NDA. If it's being used to cover up illegal discrimination, It may not be enforceable. We'll figure out how to protect you. Over the next week, Terence provided a trove of materials, emails from district managers discussing loss prevention strategies that disproportionately targeted black customers, text messages where sales associates joked about shoplifters and used coded language to describe black shoppers, and audio from a staff meeting where a regional director emphasized the need to be vigilant with customers who did not fit the store's typical demographic. The materials were damning, clear evidence of a pattern that went far beyond a single cashier making a single mistake. Marcus reviewed the documents and confirmed that the NDA Terence had signed contained language that likely made it unenforceable in the context of reporting illegal conduct. Shayla, the communications consultant, worked with Terence to prepare a statement that would protect his identity while still allowing the information to be made public. And Naomi, working with journalists at the Chicago Tribune and the Associated Press, coordinated the release of the new evidence to maximize impact. On December 2nd, the Tribune published a front-page story under the headline, "Luxury Retailer Accused of Systematic Racial Profiling." The story included Naomi's account, Terence's testimony, excerpts from the emails and recordings, and responses from civil rights experts who described the behavior as a clear violation of federal and state anti-discrimination laws. The AP picked up the story and distributed it nationally, and by midday it was trending on every major news platform. Lux Home Concepts stock, which had been relatively stable, began to drop. The company's CEO, a man named Richard Holloway, issued a statement calling the allegations deeply troubling and announcing that the company would be conducting an internal investigation. He said that Monica Ashford, the cashier involved in Naomi's incident, had been placed on administrative leave and that the company was reviewing its policies and training programs. But the statement felt inadequate, too little and too late, and it did nothing to stem the tide of criticism. Several high-profile interior designers and influencers who had partnerships with Lux Home announced they were ending their relationships with the company. Major publications pulled their advertising, and advocacy groups filed complaints with the Federal Trade Commission and the Illinois Attorney General's office, alleging violations of consumer protection laws. The pressure continued to build. Within a week, Richard Holloway held a press conference flanked by lawyers and consultants to announce that Lux Home Concepts would be implementing a comprehensive overhaul of its customer service policies. He apologized directly to Naomi, acknowledged that the company had failed to live up to its values, and committed to a series of concrete steps: mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, the creation of an independent review board to monitor complaints, the hiring of a chief diversity officer, and the establishment of a fund to support organizations working on racial justice in retail. It was a stronger response than the initial statement, but it still felt like crisis management, an attempt to contain the damage rather than a genuine reckoning. Naomi watched the press conference from Jordan's apartment, Marcus and Shayla on a video call, and felt a mixture of satisfaction and skepticism. Progress, yes, but progress driven by fear of financial consequences rather than genuine commitment to change. "They're doing the bare minimum," Shayla said. "The question is whether we keep the pressure on or accept this as a win and move on." Naomi thought about it, thought about the exhaustion she felt, the toll the last 2 weeks had taken on her mental health and her relationship and her sense of privacy. She thought about the messages she was still receiving, the mix of support and vitriol, the way her life had become a public spectacle. And then she thought about the next black woman who would walk into a Lux Home Concepts, the one who might be followed or questioned or made to feel like a criminal. And she knew what her answer had to be. "We keep going," she said. "We file formal complaints. We push for legal action. We make sure this isn't just a PR exercise, because if we stop now, nothing really changes." Marcus nodded. "Okay, then let's file with the Illinois Human Rights Commission and the Attorney General. I'll also start drafting a civil complaint. We have a strong case for discrimination, emotional distress, and potentially even defamation, depending on what was said in those phone calls." Over the next several weeks, the legal process began to unfold. The Illinois Human Rights Commission opened an investigation into Lux Home Concepts practices, interviewing current and former employees, reviewing training materials, and examining complaint records. The Attorney General's office launched its own inquiry, focusing on whether the company's conduct violated state consumer protection laws. And Marcus filed a civil lawsuit on Naomi's behalf, seeking damages and injunctive relief to force the company to implement meaningful reforms. The lawsuit was covered extensively, in part because of Jordan's involvement, in part because it represented a test case for how retail discrimination claims would be treated in the current legal and cultural climate. Lux Home Concepts responded aggressively, hiring a top-tier defense firm and issuing statements that painted Naomi as opportunistic and vindictive. They argued that Monica Ashford had been following standard fraud prevention protocols, that there had been no discriminatory intent, and that Naomi's allegations were an attempt to leverage her relationship with Jordan Whitfield for personal gain. The defense strategy was transparent: shift the focus from the company's conduct to Naomi's motives, question her credibility, and paint her as a villain rather than a victim. It was a strategy that had worked in other cases, and it required a careful, coordinated response from Naomi's team to counter. Shayla worked with Naomi to craft a series of public statements and op-eds that kept the focus on the systemic issues rather than the personal drama. Naomi wrote a piece for The Atlantic about the intersection of race, gender, and wealth, arguing that Black women faced unique challenges when it came to navigating spaces of privilege, and that the assumptions made about her in Lux Home Concepts were part of a larger pattern of bias. The piece was widely shared, cited in academic discussions, and used in training programs for customer-facing employees in various industries. Jordan, too, became more vocal. He gave interviews to several outlets, speaking candidly about his relationship with Naomi, the decision to give her access to his credit card, and the absurdity of the assumption that she would be stealing from him. He also used his platform to highlight other cases of retail discrimination, donating money to legal defense funds and advocacy organizations, and calling on other business leaders to take a stand against profiling in their own companies. The case moved slowly, as legal cases do, but the public conversation it sparked was immediate and intense. People debated whether Naomi had a responsibility to use her platform, whether Jordan's involvement made the case more or less credible, whether the focus on individual incidents distracted from larger systemic issues. And through it all, Naomi tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, going to work, spending time with friends, finding moments of peace in the apartment she shared with Jordan, even as her life was being dissected and debated by strangers. By the spring of 2026, the Illinois Human Rights Commission had issued a preliminary finding that Lux Home Concepts had engaged in discriminatory practices and recommended a consent decree. The company, facing mounting legal costs and reputational damage, agreed to settle. The settlement included a public apology to Naomi, a financial payment that she immediately donated to organizations working on racial justice in retail, and a binding commitment to implement the reforms the company had promised in its press conference, with oversight from an independent monitor for the next 5 years. Marcus called it a significant victory, one of the strongest settlements he had seen in a retail discrimination case. Shayla called it a model for how to use media and advocacy to force corporate accountability, and Naomi called it exhausting, necessary, and incomplete, because while Lux Home Concepts had been forced to change, there were thousands of other companies where similar practices persisted, unchallenged and unexamined. The civil lawsuit was settled separately, with Lux Home paying an undisclosed sum that Naomi used to establish a fund for Black women entrepreneurs in the design and home goods industries. She announced the fund in a press release, explaining that she wanted to turn the harm she had experienced into something that would create opportunity for others, and the announcement was met with widespread praise. But for Naomi, the real measure of success was quieter, more personal. It was in the messages she received from other Black women who said they had been inspired to speak out about their own experiences of discrimination. It was in the policy changes that other retailers implemented, citing Lux Home Concepts as a cautionary tale. It was in the conversations she had with young designers and architects of color, who told her that seeing someone who looked like them fight back and win had changed the way they thought about their own power and their own place in spaces that had historically excluded them. And if you have stayed with this story, if you have seen yourself or someone you love in Naomi's experience, then you understand that this is not just about one woman and one transaction. It is about the everyday violence of being presumed guilty, of having your presence questioned, of being made to prove your worth and your right to exist in spaces that should be open to everyone. And if this story has moved you, if it has angered you or inspired you or made you think, then share it. Share it with your friends, your family, your networks, because stories like this matter, and they grow stronger when more people hear them and decide to act. The months that followed brought a kind of equilibrium. The media coverage slowed, the legal cases were resolved, and Naomi found herself able to breathe again, to focus on her work and her life without the constant weight of public scrutiny. She and Jordan settled into a new rhythm, one that acknowledged the reality of the world they lived in, but refused to be defined by it. They redecorated the living room together eventually, using pieces from a variety of sources, including several items from Black-owned design studios and artisans. The cashmere blanket and the bookends from Luxe Home Concepts were donated to a local charity, not out of spite, but because Naomi could not look at them without remembering the day she had tried to buy them, and she wanted her home to be a space of comfort and joy, not a reminder of humiliation. Jordan continued to use his platform and his resources to support racial justice initiatives, funding scholarships and grants and infrastructure for Black entrepreneurs. He joined the board of a civil rights organization and became more intentional about the way his company approached diversity, not just in hiring, but in vendor selection, product design, and corporate culture. It was work that felt meaningful, work that connected his business success to the values he and Naomi shared, and it deepened his understanding of the ways that wealth and power could be used for more than just accumulation. Naomi, for her part, returned to her architecture practice with a renewed sense of purpose. She took on projects that centered community spaces in Black neighborhoods, designing parks and libraries and cultural centers that reflected the needs and aspirations of the people who would use them. She mentored young designers, particularly women of color, and she spoke at conferences and panels about the intersection of design, equity, and social justice. The experience with Luxe Home Concepts had changed her, not by making her bitter or cynical, but by clarifying what mattered and what she was willing to fight for. 2 years after the incident, a documentary filmmaker reached out to Naomi about a project exploring consumer rights and racial profiling in retail. The filmmaker, a Black man named Darius Cole, wanted to include Naomi's story as part of a broader examination of how bias played out in commercial spaces and what it would take to create systemic change. Naomi agreed to participate, seeing it as an opportunity to contextualize her experience and to highlight the work of activists and advocates who had been fighting these battles long before her story went viral. The filming took place over several months, with Darius and his crew following Naomi as she went about her daily life, conducting interviews, visiting the sites of other high-profile discrimination cases, and speaking with researchers and policy experts. The documentary, titled The Price of Presumption, premiered at Sundance in early 2028 and was subsequently picked up by a major streaming platform. The film was powerful, weaving together personal narratives, data on retail discrimination, and analysis of the legal and corporate responses to high-profile cases. Naomi's story was one of several featured, but it served as a through-line, a case study in how individual experiences of bias could become catalysts for broader change when the right conditions were in place: resources, platform, determination, and a refusal to let the harm be minimized or dismissed. In the film, Naomi spoke candidly about the toll the experience had taken, the way it had forced her to confront the limits of assimilation and respectability, the way it had clarified the difference between being tolerated in spaces of wealth and privilege and actually belonging there. She also spoke about the solidarity she had found, the network of people who had reached out to share their own stories, to offer support, to build on the momentum she had helped create. One of the most striking moments in the documentary was an interview with Monica Ashford, the cashier who had called the bank. Darius had tracked her down and convinced her to speak on camera, and the result was uncomfortable, illuminating, and human. Monica, who had been unemployed for over a year after being terminated from Luxe Home Concepts, spoke about the incident with a mixture of defensiveness and regret. She said she had been following what she believed were the right procedures, that she had been trained to look for signs of fraud, and that she had not intended to harm Naomi. But she also acknowledged, haltingly, that her assumptions had been shaped by bias, that she had seen a black woman with a white man's credit card and had jumped to conclusions that she would not have made if the customer had been white. She said that losing her job had been devastating, but that it had also forced her to confront her own prejudices, to think about the harm she had caused, and to consider how she might do better. It was not a full apology, not a complete reckoning, but it was more than most people in her position offered, and it added a layer of complexity to the story that Naomi appreciated. The documentary was well received, sparking conversations about retail discrimination, corporate accountability, and the ways that individual stories could drive systemic change. It was used in college courses, in corporate training programs, in community discussions about race and economic justice. And it ensured that Naomi's story, and the stories of countless others who had faced similar treatment, remained part of the public conversation rather than fading into the background as the news cycle moved on. For Naomi, the film's release was both satisfying and bittersweet. She was proud of the work, proud of the way it honored the complexity of the issues and the humanity of everyone involved. But she was also ready to move on, to let the story be one chapter of her life rather than the defining narrative. She had other work to do, other projects to pursue, and she was determined not to be reduced to a symbol or a cautionary tale. One evening in the fall of 2028, nearly 3 years after the incident, Naomi and Jordan sat on the balcony of their apartment, the city lights glittering below them, the lake dark and vast beyond the shore. They had just finished dinner, a simple meal they had cooked together, and they were sharing a bottle of wine and talking about their plans for the future. "Do you ever regret it?" Jordan asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Speaking out, going through all of that? Naomi thought about it, rolling the question over in her mind. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "There were moments when it felt like too much, when I wished I could just let it go and move on, but mostly no. I think it mattered. I think we made a difference, even if it's smaller than I would have liked." Jordan nodded. "I think you're right, and I think you were incredibly brave." Naomi smiled, reached for his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed me, you supported me, you used your resources to back me up. That mattered more than anything." They sat in silence for a while, watching the city, and then Naomi said, "You know what's funny? I still think about that necklace. Not the one from the story, I mean the living room. How I was just trying to buy some throw pillows and a blanket, and it turned into this whole thing." Jordan laughed, a quiet sound. "We never did finish redecorating that room." "We should," Naomi said. "Maybe this weekend. We could go to that place in Bronzeville, the one run by the couple who make custom furniture." "Yeah," Jordan said. "I'd like that." And so they did. The following Saturday, they drove to a small showroom in Bronzeville, a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side that was experiencing a cultural and economic renaissance. The showroom was run by a husband and wife team, both black, both trained in woodworking and design, and their pieces were beautiful, crafted with care and attention and a deep sense of artistry. Naomi and Jordan spent the afternoon browsing, talking with the owners, choosing pieces that felt right for their space. The transaction was easy, pleasant, marked by none of the tension or suspicion that had characterized the incident at Lux Home Concepts. When Naomi pulled out Jordan's credit card to pay, the owner smiled and said, "Beautiful card, Centurion, right? We don't see many of those." And that was it. No questions, no phone calls, no assumptions. Just a straightforward exchange between customer and merchant, the way it was supposed to be. Driving home, the back seat of the car loaded with fabric samples and measurements for a custom couch, Naomi felt a sense of peace she had not felt in a long time. It was not that the world had fundamentally changed, not that discrimination and bias had disappeared, but she had learned, through the ordeal with Lux Home Concepts and the years that followed, that change was possible when people refused to accept the status quo, when they demanded accountability, and when they built networks of support and solidarity that could sustain the long, hard work of making the world more just. And if you have read this far, if you have traveled with Naomi through the anger and the fight and the slow, uneven progress toward something better, then you understand that this is not just her story. It is a story about all of us, about the choices we make when we witness harm, about the courage it takes to speak out, and about the power of collective action to shift the systems that shape our lives. If this story has resonated with you, if it has made you think or feel or see something new, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this are how we build the world we want to live in. One conversation, one connection, one act of solidarity at a time. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new opportunities. Naomi was promoted to partner at her architecture firm, the first black woman to hold that position in the company's 40-year history. She led projects that transformed neighborhoods, that created spaces where people could gather and thrive, and she mentored a generation of young designers who saw her as proof that it was possible to succeed without compromising your values or your identity. Jordan's company continued to grow, expanding into new markets and new technologies, and he used his wealth and influence to support causes he cared about. He funded scholarships for black students in STEM fields, invested in black-owned startups, and joined coalitions of business leaders advocating for criminal justice reform and economic equity. The work was never finished, but it was work that felt meaningful, that connected his success to the well-being of others. And Lux Home Concepts, the company at the center of the incident that had changed Naomi's life, underwent significant transformation. The independent monitor required by the settlement found that the company had made genuine progress in its training and policies, though challenges remained. Employee turnover was high, in part because the changes created tension and discomfort among staff who resisted the new expectations. But over time, the culture began to shift, and incidents of profiling decreased, at least according to the data the company was required to report. Monica Ashford, the cashier who had called the bank, eventually found work at a different company, a mid-tier department store where she started over as a sales associate. She remained in Chicago, navigating the complexities of rebuilding her career and her reputation, and she carried with her the knowledge of what her assumptions had cost, both for Naomi and for herself. Whether she had truly learned from the experience, whether she had genuinely changed, was a question without a clear answer, one that would only be revealed in the choices she made going forward. Terrence Mitchell, the former employee who had provided the documentation that corroborated Naomi's claims, used the settlement he received to go back to school, pursuing a degree in public policy with a focus on consumer rights and corporate accountability. He stayed in touch with Naomi, and they occasionally collaborated on projects, speaking together at events and working with advocacy organizations to push for stronger protections against retail discrimination. And Naomi and Jordan, through all of this, built a life together that was grounded in mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to using their resources for more than just personal comfort. They got engaged in the spring of 2029, a quiet proposal on the balcony of their apartment, the city spread out below them, the future open and uncertain and full of possibility. The engagement made headlines because Jordan's name still carried weight, because people were curious about the couple whose relationship had been thrust into the public eye under such fraught circumstances. But Naomi and Jordan kept the details private, sharing only what they wanted to share, guarding the intimacy of their relationship against the intrusion of strangers and the demands of public curiosity. They married in the summer of 2030, a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, held in a garden overlooking the lake. Naomi wore a dress designed by a black fashion designer she had admired for years, and Jordan wore a suit tailored by a black-owned atelier in Chicago. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, a celebration of love and partnership and the choice to face the world together, with all its beauty and all its challenges. And when they exchanged vows, promising to support each other, to stand with each other, to fight for each other and for the values they shared, Naomi thought about the day she had walked into Lux Home Concepts with a credit card and a simple intention to buy some home goods. She thought about the moment when the cashier had looked at her and seen a criminal instead of a customer, and the chain of events that had followed, the anger and the fight, and the slow, uneven progress toward justice. She thought about all of this, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the harm that had been done, but for the clarity it had brought, the way it had forced her to confront who she was and what she stood for and what kind of world she wanted to help create. And standing there with Jordan, surrounded by people who loved them, she felt a sense of hope, not naive or uncomplicated, but grounded in the knowledge that change was possible, that resistance mattered, and that the fight for a more just world was one worth waging every single day. If you have journeyed with Naomi and Jordan through this story, through the moments of pain and power and perseverance, then you know that this is not just about a credit card or a cashier or a company. It is about the larger systems that shape how we see each other, how we treat each other, and how we decide who deserves dignity and who must fight for it. And if this story has touched you, if it has reminded you of your own experiences or inspired you to think differently about the world around you, then let it be a starting point for conversation, for action, for change. Share it with someone close to you, someone who might need to hear it, someone who is fighting their own battles and could use the reminder that they are not alone, that their voice matters, and that together we can build something better.